All right, so I've got a famously bad track record of predicting if the show that we do is going to be any good. So yeah, I have a feeling this week will probably be a pretty lame show because it's kind of like a weird old kid show from what I can tell. But man, when the weather's real shitty, like when I was walking here and the snow is blowing horizontally, and it's like walking by the river. It's just like I couldn't. First, I'm trying to walk through the footprints in the frozen snow that someone else left. Because if you go too far to the edges, you just fall down and get snow in your boots. And the wind was so like strong that it's like slowing down how fast I can walk. I'm like, man, this is fucking insane. But it makes sitting inside and watching an old TV show seem way better. You know, it's like finally I can get out of this crap for half an hour and just chill out and watch some weird old shit.
So what do you got? Let me see if I've heard of it.
I can guarantee you did not, because this is Captain Video and his Video Rangers. And the reason I assume you didn't is because it was on the DuMont television network.
Never heard of any of them.
Yeah.
Well, we've heard of DuMont before
Right.
in this business, but I never heard of it in the real world.
Yeah, so let's just do a quick sidebar about DuMont, because yeah, so this aired on DuMont from 1949 to 1955. I think this is a 1949 one, this episode. It aired daily, like 5 days a week, and then they started throwing in Saturday ones. So it's like 1,537 episodes. But as it was the style at the time of not keeping anything, and especially this network that doesn't even exist anymore, I think they said there's something like 26 episodes that still exist.
Isn't that too bad?
Yeah, and wait till I get into this. This story's crazy. So DuMont, yeah, it's weird because the other networks of the time, like CBS and NBC, we still know. I read through the whole wiki page about DuMont. It gets into all these details and stuff. But basically, it started in 1942. It was one of the very first networks, and Jackie Gleason was one of their big stars. So, I mean, they had, they were known.
Then 1942 TV.
Yeah, they were really early.
That's really early.
And basically, what it all seemed to kind of boil down to, you could go through all the details and stuff, but it's just that in those early days, like everything was new, trying to figure out even just how to expand from New York out into these different markets, and just having to grow your company along with that, and all the new regulations.
Was DuMont a New York company?
Yeah, I think most of them were mostly, it was, just same as today, New York and LA. Everything was East Coast and West Coast. And just all of those little hurdles you got to jump, and all these little bows you got to tie, of like when FCC regulations started happening for each new market, everything, like just so much stuff you had to navigate. So I guess it just stands to reason that if there's like 3 or 4 networks, one of them just didn't make it. Like things just didn't work out, and just too many legal problems and too many money problems. So even though at the time they seemed fine and they were up there with the other ones, nowadays it's thought of as like the forgotten network, because by 1956 they were out of there. So yeah, that's kind of the story of DuMont. And then because of, like I was saying, nobody kept stuff back then, but it's extra bad with DuMont because at least NBC and CBS, they weren't really paying attention, or BBC, to their old stuff, but they at least were a continual concern. So some of the stuff just accidentally was saved. Whereas by 1970, by the 70s, there was some other company that owned whatever used to be DuMont, owned their intellectual property and stuff. And they're like, man, we got these warehouses full of these old kinescopes or whatever, of these old shows, 1,500 episodes of fucking Captain Video. Like, what is all this trash? Why are we paying to keep this stuff? Because in the 70s, not only could they not foresee the internet, they didn't even foresee like VHS players, or just certainly not DVD or replaying shows on TV. They couldn't even imagine what they were ever going to do with this junk. So there's this one story in the 90s. They did like a congressional hearing about preservation of old television to find out what happened to some of this stuff. And apparently they filled 3 giant like garbage trucks full of old DuMont TV shows. And this is another thing that's just funny about the 70s. They didn't even take it to like a landfill or something. They just dumped it into the into New York Bay and the East River.
Oh my God! What an environmental faux pas!
Yeah, so it's bad on every level. They got rid of all these old classic TV shows, and they just dumped them in the fucking river.
Oh, isn't that disgusting? Just
So yeah, and it's like people that used to work for this holdings company knew this story, but they never found out who actually gave the order to do this
And you know
horrible
what
thing.
makes it even more sickening? In the 1970s, there was a whole lot of talk about environment and acid rain, and
Yeah.
they're doing that kind of shit.
Yeah.
Disgusting.
And yet another story of how New York is gross. I'll never understand people's love of New York, but yeah, they're just dumping shit into the river. Because I guess you can't see it, it's gone, whatever. It's gone now, don't worry about it. So yeah, and I got to assume too, as far as you're saying with our environmental stuff, I don't know specifically what a kinescope is, but if it's anything like the acetate that they make movie film and stuff with, like that's not going anywhere. It's still down there somewhere. So anyway, yeah, we could get into more detail about DuMont, but that's the long and the short of it. It's just a network that didn't make it. And this show seems pretty emblematic of maybe why they didn't make it. Is they keep mentioning how this show, even for the time, was low budget, and it was so low budget that, and they showed it every day, to fill time instead of the whole half hour being Captain Video. Oh, I'd be interested to see if this episode is like this. A lot of the episodes in the middle, for like there'd be like 7 minutes a show at the start and 7 minutes at the end, and the 7 minutes in the middle was old cowboy movies. Because they bought the rights to a bunch of old westerns. Yeah, they bought the rights to a bunch of old westerns, and they just had them laying around. So they would say like, and now we'll cut to the adventures of some of Captain Video's undercover agents on Earth, and pretend that these cowboys were somehow affiliated with Captain Video.
Well, I was wondering how they made so many shows, because that's a lot of episodes. Well, if a third of them are remakes, half stealing from somebody else.
And fantastically incongruous. Like, that doesn't fit at all. It doesn't, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. Although, speaking of that, it was so low budget that they say watching these shows, like, you assume Captain Video and his Space Patrol, whatever, that it's a sci-fi show. But they say actually watching it, it's so low budget that it's hard to tell if it is set in the future or if it's just set in the current day. Because you can't, it's just a bunch of people hanging out on a set, right? And they occasionally mention like Pluto and stuff, but they don't do anything spacey. So yeah, it just seems like the definition of a cheap kid show that no one cares about. But they played it at about 7:30 at night because quite a few adults apparently liked it. It was one of their most famous shows.
Okay, so let's have a view as adults and see what we think.
The other, I guess, a couple other little tiny things I learned about it. They filmed it in the same building as a big department store, and this was one of those shows that was live, like they didn't pre-tape it. So there's a lot of like times where actors had to turn away from the camera so they wouldn't laugh and stuff if something went wrong. But since they worked in the same building as this department store, right before filming, they would just run downstairs and buy stuff from the department store to use as props that day. And their prop budget was $25 a week, apparently, is like the story. Like, it's so hard to find anything about this DuMont network that this is just like oral history stuff that people who used to work there brought up later. No one can confirm any of this stuff. There was a guy who played a villain on the show, and he had a nervous breakdown because of the insane amount of overwork. So they just replaced him with a different guy who was nothing at all like him. And they just said that the villain, they didn't say he was a new villain. They said he's the same guy, but he underwent plastic surgery to outwit Captain Video. And it's like, so now he looks like this now. Like, it seems like it'd be one of these things like Ed Wood or something. Like, it would be great to make a movie about working on this show, because it sounds like it's just a disaster. And I guess the most famous thing about this now is that one of the characters on The Honeymooners, which I don't really know much about The Honeymooners, but this character, Ed Norton.
Oh, was he in this?
No, in The Honeymooners, he was a fan of Captain Video and watched it all the time. But most people nowadays, like in the comments on the YouTube video that we're going to watch, people were like, oh, you mean that weird show that Ed Norton watched all the time on The Honeymooners? Like, I thought that was just a show they made up in The Honeymooners, but that was a real show.
Oh.
And they made a mere 1,500 episodes. But yeah, like, nobody even knows about this. And yeah, what's left of those like 20 or so that are left, there's only 5 or 6 that are released to the public, and the rest you have to get an appointment at like the Institute of TV Archives, whatever, to see the other ones. But at least they're not all gone. I mean...
Okay.
And yeah, from the sounds of it, if this is good, I'll be a monkey's uncle. So it probably doesn't matter that much that we don't have all 1,500, but still weird to put all that work into something and now there's barely any left.
Okay, well, let's check her out.
When was that?
Captain Video in the...
Oh yeah, I read about this too. That's his base or whatever, but it's just a drawing somebody made, and they just filmed the drawing. So there we go, one of the last remaining pieces of the old DuMont network.
It wasn't the most exciting space show that I've seen. But hey, in 1949, if that was all that was available, I would watch that, and I'd be looking forward to the next one, too.
Yeah, it was, I guess, better than I thought it would be because, yeah, like that saying it was like a kid show, it didn't really feel like a kid show. Like, you could see grown-ups watching that. Like, they at least took it serious. Like, I was afraid it was going to be a lot of... Because we watched a little bit of, remember we watched British Space Patrol by accident, but then we checked out the American Space Patrol, and it was like, hey, kids, eat your cereal. And I'm just like, ugh.
They dumbed down, they dumbed down for kids. And this one didn't do that.
Yeah, this one, it took itself pretty seriously. And, I mean, it's funny, though, because, yeah, we were saying how the villain... There's two villains, I guess. One of them almost was like Dracula or something. Just his eyebrows and his weird, like...
And he had his hair down in a point, super black hair, and he had just the tiniest little mark on his chin for his little goatee.
Yeah. And then the other villain guy, he did this long evil monologue, and they kept zooming in on his face. And
the professor there, or the doctor, whatever he's called, but he's an Earthman for sure.
Right.
And they made him look like an Earthman. He had on his shirt, his casual shirt, and his casual pants,
and his little belt and stuff. But like, I've never seen that close up. You know, like in a movie script, they call that like the extreme close-up where your whole face doesn't even fit in the screen. And like, yeah, it's like, wow, the bad guys are pretty evil. But Captain Video, I guess in yesterday's episode, he fought with the guy because he's all bandaged up and stuff. But all he did in this episode was the clerical repercussions of the fight of like, all right, now we got to talk to Earth Command and we got to discuss what to do with this guy and we got to send a message. I'm like, damn, I wish we saw yesterday's show.
Yeah, and the other guy that he supposedly had this fight with although he was kind of sitting kind of dazed in the corner when we were first introduced to him. He didn't seem to have any physical injuries, but Captain Video did. He had the blood spot on his head and forehead and on his nose and
bandage on his hand.
Yeah, he had the knuckles were all marked red, or we presume red. It's in black and white.
But yeah, there's definitely like, also I see what they mean about the, not anachronisms, I guess, but it's like they make some effort to feel futuristic, but sometimes they just say, never mind. Like,
especially with talking on the telephone.
Yeah, despite the fact that, like you were saying, it was like a speaker that was emanating from somewhere, but he still had an earpiece to his ear that was apparently doing nothing. But yeah, wristwatches and belts and collared shirts and suits and ties, you know, like that's a classic giveaway of like, it's corny in other space shows how their futuristic clothes are usually just jumpsuits, but it's because you can't have a suit and tie. That's 20th century. But here they're like, yeah, well, suit and tie it is. I'm sure those will still be popular in the future. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't bad. And it did have that thing. I wasn't sure if they would do it this early on, but the old Western. No question there. So yeah, it did it two separate times where it cut to a little screen that just said like, hey, a message to your video rangers. And it was like it reminded me of the G.I. Joe cartoons in the 80s where they were like, you know, don't talk to strangers or whatever. This was the, you know, surprisingly progressive of like, hey, don't be prejudiced against people. Be a good video ranger.
Yeah. And the first one was, don't disgrace the flag by trampling on the flag or putting down the flag. Betsy Ross sewed that flag.
Which I didn't care for that one as much because that's some classic Americana nonsense.
Those are very, though, American messages for youth of respect your country, and
right.
then but the one on
like
discrimination
equality, yeah.
and all that kind of surprised me because this is 1949, and yet they're telling their little rangers that color makes no difference. Treat everybody equally, and okay.
Yeah.
That's kind of nice to hear in 1949.
I wonder if at the same time, if we had the commercials, though, if it would have been like, and now a sponsorship from Rice Crinkle cereal or whatever, just some
They
weird.
had no commercials.
Yeah, I don't know if there were commercials that would have been in there. Maybe. I'm not sure, because it was like 26 minutes. It wasn't the whole half hour, so we're probably missing.
Yeah, okay, so possibly, yeah, you could have, yeah.
So yeah, it had those little messages of like, hey, be a good ranger, here's how to be a good American. And then, yeah, it would just kind of zoom in on some kind of like, it looked like a radar dish from a submarine or something. And that's how I guess we get our view into Captain Video's compatriots back on Earth and what they're up to, which is just an old Western. So yeah, that was pretty weird, because it was just probably some B-movie Western from, earlier in the decade, or who knows
If
how far
I
back.
was a kid, I definitely would have watched those, and I would have looked forward to the next episode. As an adult, taking the time that it was, and that there would be very limited television viewing at the time, you know what, I probably would have watched it too, and looked forward to the next episode.
And the Western thing, like, it was nonsense, but it did break it up, because like a lot of this was really just all talking. It was either Captain Video talking to his friends that were dressed like Romans for some reason, like ancient Romans, but he's either discussing bureaucracy details with them, or it's the villains hatching villainous schemes, but it is just people talking.
But
so at least the
villains,
Western...
even though nothing really happened in this episode,
Right.
it was a setup
Right.
for the next episode. Because you're like thinking, okay, those evil guys, what are they going to be doing next? And at the very end, as Captain Video presumably is going to his spaceship to go off back to Earth in another episode, they're setting up a sabotage of some kind.
Right.
So it finished off with all that stuff, and then the narrator comes in and has the questions like, what will happen if, blah, blah, where we're going to be. So of course, as a viewer, you'd be like, oh my God, what is going to happen? Even though nothing happened tonight, what is going to happen? And you would buy right into it and watch it.
I'm willing to bet too that those the machinations of the villains probably eventually led to Captain Video punching them out. Probably.
I'm sure it was.
But yeah, in these like setup episodes, like the Western part at least did shake things up, because it is like, instead of watching a whole B-movie Western that was probably 70 or 80 minutes long, instead we just saw the gunfight, and then we saw them trussing up all the bad guys and sending them off, and like just the exciting parts.
To walk back to town.
Yeah. It's funny though, because the thing with the Western, it's like, that eternal debate of like art versus commerce that has been going on since the beginning of time. There's no question there. There's no artistic justification possible. It's pure commerce. It's just, we got to fill time, and we own these old Westerns. Put them in the show. So I mean, it's impressive in that way, of just that blatant capitalism of just like.
But you also again have to put this viewing into it when it was done, like the time and the place that all this was happening. So yeah, sure, you can accept the fact. Well, I find it a little hard with the telephones, but those other things that they were using, the microphone and that for corresponding and that. Again, very few people would have had TV in these days.
Yeah.
There would be very little advertising money that would have allowed them to have really top-notch sets. And with their kind of shitty sets that they had, the painted backdrops and all that stuff, they were able to pull off a little, good, not a bad little show.
Yeah, I think it's a case where, like that Wikipedia article, it made me like the show better because it was setting me up to think it would be a lot worse. Because, like, calling it a kid's show is kind of a misnomer. And yeah, talking about how cheap it was, I mean, yeah, it's like, okay, that backdrop is just a drawing, and, it's a random mishmash of, like, these people are wearing Roman Halloween costumes or something, where this guy is just dressed in a normal suit, and, like, it's all kind of a mishmash. But I can't think of anything we saw from 1949 or 1950 that was all that great.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
and the acting was really
pretty good.
Decent. It wasn't, like sometimes in these early shows that we've been watching, the acting is overacted. It's as if you're on a stage and you have to speak to that guy who's way back there at the back of the audience. So you kind of have to really overemphasize it.
And the
They didn't
villains,
do that.
the
They
villains
were very-
kind of did, but obviously deliberately.
Yeah, but just in case you weren't getting that they were evil, they had to kind of bring that out at you. But they didn't overact in the sense of yelling out things or talking in a very staid type, very dramatic. There wasn't any of that. They were pretty normal for television acting.
Especially Captain Video, maybe getting into a fist fight calms him. He was very level.
Very low key. Actually, the young fellow that stood out as being a little bit like not great was that young ranger guy.
Yeah. Which again, isn't that funny that it's the same exact thing again? There's always the teen sidekick. So again,
yes, you're right. There's the teen sidekick.
and they had the identical hairstyle, except their part was on the opposite side.
Yeah.
So when they were talking to each other, you could see both parts, both of the parts in their hair. I don't know if that's just an accident or what, but yeah, and, we couldn't totally. Again, we're just jumping in somewhere in the middle of 1,500 episodes, but it's like, okay, it's definitely not Mars because somebody else talks about, in Mars, our trade sanctions are blah, blah, blah. And it's not Earth because they got a rocket message from Earth, which they had to wait for the rocket to cool down.
And supposedly they're going back to Earth.
Right.
So we have no idea exactly what planet they are on.
Somebody mentioned how delicious Jupiter grapes were. So I'm going to assume it's Jupiter and they didn't also import Jupiter grapes. They're probably just eating Jupiter grapes because they're on
Didn't
Jupiter.
they say something about Pluto?
Oh, maybe. Yeah, it's
At
very...
one point. They definitely did not really make that clear. But maybe they did in an earlier episode. That if you're watching along, you know where they are.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure, yeah. I mean, there was a narrator at the start who caught us up, but the sound quality's a little rough. I didn't catch all of it. But yeah, it's definitely, I guess that's what that show is. It's just a huge mishmash of like, it's sort of futuristic and sort of not. It's sort of arch and sort of naturalistic. It's sort of space and sort of a Western. It's just sort of everything.
But it was okay.
Yeah.
It was okay.
Yeah, I really do feel like it would be a really cool movie to make a movie nowadays about people working on that show, and just like every day you got to grind out a new episode and you got to find props and you got to perform it live. Like that would be interesting. Yeah, as for Captain Video itself, like again, it's a shame that all the episodes are gone, but if you've seen one, you've seen 1,500.
True enough.